In the Bible, the book of Acts gives us the beginning of the Christian church. It talks about what happened after Jesus died and rose again, and before the formation of the formal organizations that we see today. And so the book of Acts is the transition period in between when Jesus was on the earth and when all of the rest of church history happened. It ties together the epistles in the last part of the New Testament with the gospel accounts at the beginning. And today we're in Acts chapter 7, and we've been introduced to a man named Stephen. He was chosen as a deacon, and Stephen was then falsely accused and brought before the Jewish leaders. And so here in chapter 7, we hear Stephen's defense. And Steve, this is a masterwork of evangelism to a Jewish audience.
Yeah, and just like what we saw in the previous through Peter and the apostles, where they were talking about, gave us a little bit of a pattern of how to express the gospel and preach the gospel. Same thing here. It's a little bit of a continuation with Stephen, and we see Stephen take a little bit different approach. Peter and Paul and the apostles in the previous two examples, they really talked about the resurrection. That was a main theme that was in it. And so in this section here, as we go through it with Stephen, he really doesn't talk about the resurrection, but yet it's about the gospel and about the good news of Jesus Christ and who he is.
And a few thoughts before we just dive into chapter 7 here. One of the things I'm impressed with is most of the people that were spoken of here, as far as the apostles and the deacons and the early Christians, these were just common people. Right. They were just regular folks.
Right.
And through their lives, they were not really accustomed to being in the halls of power, and certainly not accustomed to confronting leaders that had control over their lives. And so people like Stephen, when we see the strength of his defense, and the boldness of which he speaks and the clarity of which he speaks, it's really the Holy Spirit that's speaking through him.
Correct.
Because in their natural strength, Stephen, Peter, John, none of these people would have been able to stand up and do this. To keep in mind, they're in the temple speaking before the highest, most powerful people in the government.
And with all of these examples that we have, we see them, they're not shouting, they're not out of control, they're not cowering. They're just simply stating factual information and giving factual information and giving a defense of Jesus and who he is and why they're believers in Jesus. And so, again, we can use these as examples of how we should interact with other people that might be hostile to us as we preach or proclaim the gospel as well.
And so the context here is important. Stephen has been falsely accused of saying blasphemous things against the temple and the government.
Yeah.
And so he has now been brought before the leaders. And what he's going to do here in chapter 7 is give a history of Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, David, and Solomon. And in doing so, it's a fairly long description of what happened in the past with these early fathers of the Jewish nation. And what he does when he does this is, one, he shows that he understands Jewish history quite well.
Mm-hmm.
And still today, the approach that Stephen took in Acts 7 is a really good method to use when we're trying to evangelize Jewish people.
Right.
Because it shows that there's a flow to the Jewish history. And that what Stephen is doing is he's saying, where you are right now, Jewish leaders,
right,
the Jewish nation hasn't always been right here.
Right.
And he's showing some changes, and what he's showing is some successes and failures that have happened and some changes that have happened in Jewish history. And he ends it, of course, with what happened with Jesus Christ. The other thing that's interesting here, again, this is a trial. And Stephen never defends himself against the false charges.
Right.
He just explains God's actions and Israel's failures.
Exactly.
And he's not defending himself as Stephen.
Right.
He's presenting the Christian message.
Yeah, he didn't say, no, I didn't do that, or I didn't do this, or here's the reason I did that, or here's what authority do you have to arrest me? There's none of that. It's just a straightforward, basically, I think he was preaching to them the same thing that he had been preaching at the other areas, right?
Right.
To the people.
When he was talking to the common people, he's giving the same thing here. So as we go through this, keep in mind that what he's doing is he is reminding these Jewish leaders that their forefathers failed to recognize God's movement in history, or they failed to recognize a series of prophets who were either establishing the nation or delivering them from problems. So there was a series of people, such as Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph, were all ones that God had set up, and they didn't have anything to do with their own success.
Right.
God moved through them. And then Joseph, Moses, and David were all people who the Jews failed to recognize the first time they saw them.
Right.
If you think of it, Joseph, Moses, and David were people that God had inspired, but the Jewish nation, when they first saw them, failed to realize, hey, this is really God's deliverer.
Right. They were rejected, and then later on, the rejected person became their redeemer. And we'll see that as we go through the stories. And so through that, Stephen is comparing Jesus to the same thing. Here's Jesus, who you have not recognized and you have rejected. He's also going to be our redeemer. And when he comes again, that's when we're going to see our redemption, or him redeem us. And
so to our audience, don't lose that main message there as we go through this, because there's a fair amount of detail.
Yeah.
The last thing before we read is, I learned here that Stephen seems to know his Bible pretty well, and he can summarize it on a moment's notice. Right. So I was impressed with that. So, Steve, can you read, just start at verse 1 says, the high priest said, are these things so?
Right.
So the high priest is asking them respond to these false accusations. So, Steve, start at verse 2 and read through verse 8.
And he said, hear me, brethren and fathers, the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran, and said to him, leave your country and your relatives and come into the land that I will show you. Then he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. From there, after his father died, God had him move to this country in which you are now living. But he gave him no inheritance in it, not even a foot of ground. And yet, even when he had no child, he promised that he would give it to him as a possession and to his descendants after him. But God spoke to this effect, that his descendants would be aliens in a foreign land, and that they would be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. And whatever nation to which they will be in bondage, I myself will judge, said God. And after that, they will come out and serve me in this place. And he gave him the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham became the father of Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day. And Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob of the 12 patriarchs.
So Stephen is going through, he starts with Abraham. Of course, he was the original forefather of the nation Israel. The thing that I find here is, if you look at what Stephen just said, each of these verses, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, has God doing something, and it's all really God.
Right.
God appeared. God said. God moved Abraham into the land. God promised to give Abraham's children the land. God spoke. God says, I will judge Egypt. God gave Abraham the covenant. God did this. God did that.
Right.
Stephen is not giving Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob credit for anything here. It was all God working through them. And so, to me, that's the first lesson, is he's having a very high view of what God does by moving people.
Right. And he uses here in this first part, one of his arguments is that even when Abraham came into this land, he actually didn't have anything, but God said that he was going to give him this land. But first, he was going to be taken into exile, or his descendants were going to be taken into exile for 400 years. And so as we go through this, we'll see Stephen build his argument, but you get a sense that here are these leaders that he's talking. These are the leaders of the Sanhedrin. This is like the Supreme Court. There's 70 of them, and they're just like the Supreme Court.
It's like the legislature, executive branch, and the Supreme Court all rolled into one.
There you go. That's a good way to put it. And so you get this sense of, because of they're in this position of power and who they are and everything, that they're connected to the land, to Jerusalem, to the temple. And they use that from a standpoint of saying, this is why we are special. This is why and so and again, we saw Jesus talk about they truly in their hearts, they didn't really believe and recognize him, and etc. So we know that that's how they are from our gospel stories and Jesus' contention with them. But we see Stephen's first approach, not only going all the way back to Abraham, right, which was before there was actually a Jewish nation, but we also see him say, yes, God told him to move here, but when he told him to move here, he didn't have any land at that particular point in time. It was just a promise to him.
Right. And so, again, those leaders, just like you pointed out, Steve, thought they were something special. We're descended from Abraham. Look at our positions of power. We're part of the Sanhedrin. And one of Stephen's first messages is, remember your forefathers?
Mm-hmm.
They were nothing special.
Right.
The only reason they were remembered is because God did this.
Exactly.
God did that. God moved them from here to there.
Right.
God did all these things. It wasn't anything in Abraham that made him special. It was what God did through Abraham. So that's the first lesson. And the next thing that is here, he's summarizing all this movement and all this change. The God of glory appeared to Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, moved him to Haran. Then he gave him this covenant and did this promise. And there are all these changes that were happening because of God. God did these things.
You know, one thing I just want to bring out, Glenn, that just came to me is that, as we mentioned, in verse 5, he says, but he, being God, gave him, Abraham, no inheritance in it, not even a foot of ground. And yet when he had no child, he promised that he would give it to him as a possession. It's very clear that it's God's land to give.
Yes.
It's what you're saying. It's God's land to give. And what came to me is it's the same today.
It's
the
same
nation,
today.
The land and the nation of Israel, that they're where they are. It's God's land today. It was given to Abraham and his descendants through Isaac and Jacob, but it's still God's land, and they have it as a possession because of the promise of God, not because of something that they did, not because they cultivated it, not because they have done things to it. It's because God has given it to them.
And the same thing's true not only for the land of Israel, but it's the same thing that happens in our lives.
Right.
Anything I might have, whether it's a talent or a possession or some gift, it's not because of anything that I have. It's really God's.
Right.
And anything that would make me of any value at all wasn't because of me. It's something God did through me. And if he's going to accomplish something, then it's his, and he should get the credit.
And I think that you're doing a good job of explaining that, Glenn, from the standpoint of that's what Stephen is really, that's where he's starting, right? Hey, this is all starting with God. It's not starting with our ancestors, so to speak. It's starting with what God has done.
The part you just read there, Steve, was when Stephen is repeating the Abrahamic covenant.
Yep.
Where God promised to give the land to Abraham and his descendants. And that is a key concept that plays through all of the history of the New Testament and the Old Testament. The Jews will be forever associated with that land. They will either be on the land or they'll be dispossessed from the land, wanting to get back to the land.
Right.
But that land has been, is, and will be a part of Jewish history and the rest of Christian prophecy. And it's mentioned here again in the New Testament. After the day of Pentecost, Stephen brings up the Abrahamic covenant because it's still relevant.
Yes.
So his first point was that God created movement and progress in Israel's history. God called out Abraham specifically. God moved Israel to Egypt, and then delivered them out of Egypt. And in verse 7, God was going to judge Egypt. Stephen is saying God will judge disobedience and will accuse later in this same talk, down in verse 51, he's going to accuse the Jews that are in front of him right now of disobedience.
Right.
So he's making this connection. Just like Egypt got judged, you're going to get judged.
Right.
That's what he's going to say here in a few minutes. So he also mentions many of the other lands that were a part of Israel's history. He was emphasizing that God works in other places besides Jerusalem. He doesn't work just here. He works in Mesopotamia. He works in Haran. He took them out of the land of Chaldeans.
Right.
God moves and he works in other places. So I'll read the next few verses here, starting at verse 9. The patriarchs became jealous of Joseph and sold him into Egypt. Yet God was with him and rescued him from all his afflictions and granted him favor and wisdom in the sight of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he made him governor over Egypt and all his household. Now a famine came over Egypt and Canaan, a great affliction with it, and our fathers could find no food. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent our fathers there the first time. On the second visit, Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and Joseph's family was disclosed to Pharaoh. Then Joseph sent word and invited Jacob his father and his relatives to come with him, 75 persons in all. And Jacob went down to Egypt, and there he and our fathers died. From there they were removed to Shechem, and laid in the tomb which Abraham had purchased for the sum of money from the sons of Hamor in Shechem. Now, at first glance, you're saying, okay, Stephen, why are you telling me all this history? You were accused of blasphemy. Why are you doing all this history?
Right.
But there's a point here. He's very calculatingly telling this history. And what he's giving here is he's going to Egypt and explaining what happened there.
Right.
And in Jewish history, going to Egypt and coming out of that is huge.
Yes.
I mean, it's still to this day, it's huge. Mm-hmm. The annual Passover meal that every faithful Jew still celebrates to this day mentions going to Egypt and coming back. This is a big thing that's always mentioned in the history of the Jews, is that God delivered them out of Egypt.
I just want to say God's deliverance of them out of Egypt.
So the patriarchs of the 12 tribes did not recognize Joseph and sold him into slavery.
Right.
That's one of his messages here, is that they didn't recognize Joseph.
Correct.
Sold him into slavery. And he's reminding the Jews that the patriarchs did not recognize Joseph and tried to kill him. Remember the story with Joseph. What did the patriarchs, the leaders of the 12 tribes that became Israel, what did they try to do to Joseph? They were going to kill him.
Yeah, they were going to kill him, and they had him in a pit, a cistern. And Reuben, one of his brothers, said, "No, let's don't do that. Let's here comes some traders, slave traders." And so they sold him to them, and then he went into Egypt. And then from that, he becomes through various circumstances, he becomes a leader of Egypt. And so, and just again, for our listeners who may not know the full story, which I won't go into, but Joseph was one of the 12 brothers. It's from the 12 sons of Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and we have the 12 tribes of Israel. From those 12 sons, Joseph was one of them. He was the youngest one, and he was the one that was sold into slavery because they were going to kill him. So that's the point, though, that you brought out, that's what Stephen's making. They didn't recognize who he was, and they rejected him, yet it comes back later that he actually is their redeemer, salvation.
Right. And that's what he's saying here in verse 9. The patriarchs became jealous of Joseph and sold him into Egypt, yet God was with him.
Right.
That's his message. And Joseph gets sold into Egypt, and he's a type of Christ. He's a picture of Christ. What Stephen's going to do is he's going to say, remember Joseph? You hold yourself to be a descendant of the fathers of Israel. Well, those fathers sold an innocent man, tried to kill him, sold him into Egypt, but God was with him.
Right.
That's his message.
In these first few verses, part of the summation is that God began the Jewish nation with a covenant, which you explained. God's revelation was given outside as well as inside the land, and that God used a rejected one in order to save the rejectors. So That's kind of brings us up to where we are right now.
Right. So he's reminding the Jewish leaders of the failures of their fathers that they hold so dear. So the next section starts at verse 17, and it's a little longer, but he's going to talk about how God is bringing Israel out of Egypt. So I'm starting at verse 17. But as the time of the promise was approaching, which God had assured to Abraham, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt until there arose another king over Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph. It was he who took shrewd advantage of our race and mistreated our fathers so that they would expose their infants and they would not survive. It was at this time that Moses was born, and he was lovely in the sight of God, and he was nurtured 3 months in his father's home. And after he had been set outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and nurtured him as her own son. Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in words and deeds. But when he was approaching the age of 40, it entered his mind to visit his brethren, the sons of Israel. And when he saw one of them being treated unjustly, he defended him and took vengeance for the oppressed by striking down the Egyptian. And he supposed that his brethren understood that God was granting them deliverance through him, but they did not understand. On the following day, he appeared to them as they were fighting together, and he tried to reconcile them in peace, saying, Men, you are brethren. Why do you injure one another? But the one who was injuring his neighbor pushed him away, saying, Who made you a ruler and judge over us? You do not mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday, do you? At this remark, Moses fled and became an alien in the land of Midian, where he became the father of 2 sons. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai in the flame of a burning thorn bush. When Moses saw it, he marveled at the sight, and as he approached to look more closely, there came the voice of the Lord, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Moses shook with fear and would not venture to look. But the Lord said to him, Take off the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt, and have heard their groans, and I have come down to rescue them. Come now, and I will send you to Egypt. This Moses, whom they disowned, saying, Who made you a ruler and a judge, is the one whom God sent to both a ruler and a deliverer with the help of the angel who appeared to him in the thorn bush. This man led them out, performing wonders and signs in the land of Egypt, and in the Red Sea, and in the wilderness for 40 years. So there, Stephen explains the entire story of what happened with Moses in Egypt.
Right.
So it's the story of God bringing Israel out of Egypt. Part of what's going on here is that Moses was a man who defended the oppressed just like Jesus did. Moses thought that the Jews would understand that he was there to deliver them, but they didn't understand.
Right.
Likewise, the Jews that Stephen was talking to didn't understand that Jesus was there to deliver them.
Correct. That's exactly right. That's the implication that Stephen is making in here and trying to convey to these Jewish leaders.
If you liked what you heard, subscribe to Reasoning Through the Bible today. Don't miss this opportunity to grow in your knowledge and love of God's Word. Subscribe to Reasoning Through the Bible on your favorite podcast platform. He's going to great lengths here to remind them, hey, remember your fathers that you're so proud of? They're the ones that didn't recognize who Moses was. And they're the ones that pushed back against Moses. But when Moses came back the second time, he was there to deliver him.
Yeah, so we see that Moses has an understanding within himself that he is of Jewish descent and that he, in some way, some fashion, he is in a position where he can help his fellow brethren the Hebrews, yet they didn't understand that.
And Moses is one of these pictures of Christ again. There's several of them in the Old Testament, and Moses is one. And so in verse 36, it talks about wonders and signs. The people of Egypt needed signs, miracles, to prove to them that Moses was a true prophet. And Stephen's audience had seen signs and wonders from Jesus,
right,
and signs and wonders from the apostles. So they understood Stephen's connection,
right,
of Moses and Jesus. And so at this point in Stephen's defense, it's not really a defense, in Stephen's response to them, they're starting to get the picture here. Hey, remember Joseph? Remember Moses?
Mm-hmm.
Here's the story. And I'm sure the Jewish leaders at this point in the story, they're seeing some parallels between what he's saying about Moses and what they already knew about Jesus.
And I think that in those stories, even as we have learned about them as children and as we have subsequently studied them, maybe in our lifetime, we look at them from that one view of, yes, Joseph was sold and he became a leader and he redeemed him. Yes, Moses was saved from the bulrushes, became a leader in the Egyptian household, and then he ultimately God called him and he was a savior to the people. But we do, I know I have, until I looked at this and studied this, I had kind of overlooked that both of them had been rejected, yet turned out to be the Redeemer. And so again, that's the connection, or a connection, one of them. There's many. That's one of the things that Stephen is coming back and pounding into them. You've rejected Jesus and you don't understand who he is. And yet, just like Joseph and Moses, he is our Redeemer.
So next, Stephen's going to remind them what happened when Moses brought them out into the wilderness. And how Israel disobeyed in the wilderness period. So Steve, can you read from 37 down to 43?
This is the Moses who said to the sons of Israel, God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. This is the one who was in the congregation in the wilderness together with the angel who was speaking to him on Mount Sinai and who was with our fathers. And he received living oracles to pass on to you. Our fathers were unwilling to be obedient to him, but repudiated him, and in their hearts turned back to Egypt, saying to Aaron, make for us gods who will go before us. For this Moses who led us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what happened to him. At that time they made a calf and brought a sacrifice to the idol, and were rejoicing in the works of their hands. But God turned away and delivered them up to serve the host of heaven, as it is written in the book of the prophets. It was not to me that you offered victims and sacrifices 40 years in the wilderness, was it, O house of Israel? You also took along the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of the god of Ramphah, the images which you made to worship. I also will remove you beyond Babylon.
Now, to kind of get a picture of what Stephen's doing here and how their audience would react, helps to know a little bit of Jewish history. The Jews back in the old days, after they came out of Egypt, were still worshiping idols.
Right.
The book of Judges talks about this quite a bit. And we talked about that when we taught Judges. But for many years, the Jewish leaders were given over, and the Jewish people were given over to idol worship. And God ultimately judged them severely by sending in Babylon and Assyria to take these people away into captivity.
Yep.
Well, once they came back after the Babylonian captivity, the Jewish leaders were vehemently against idol worship.
Yeah.
And so by the time of the first century, by the time of Christ, at the time Stephen is talking here, these Jewish leaders did not want anything to do with idols because they learned their lesson. They got taken to the woodshed and they said, never again, we will not have idols. And so when Stephen brings this up, he's bringing up a period in their history saying, you remember those Jewish fathers you're so proud of?
Right.
They worship Molech. They missed it when Moses was really the deliverer, and they were disobeying. They worshiped a golden calf. And so that would have really rubbed against the fur, really grated against the feelings of these Jewish leaders, because now Stephen is saying, your fathers worshipped idols. And they missed worshiping the true God. And so I'm sure right now the faces are getting a little red of the Jewish leaders, and their blood pressure is rising.
Right.
Because this is probably a section of their history that they didn't want to talk about.
Yeah. And again, Stephen is telling them, here our ancestors were following God, supposedly, but yet they were worshiping idols. And so you get, again, this is what's happening here. They just got through killing and crucifying recently Jesus, God. And here they are, we're following God, but yet they don't understand. And so even though they say they're following God, they're really not, because they haven't understood and they've missed the boat, so to speak, in regards to it. So again, Stephen is using this as an example. Our ancestors said they were following God, but at the same time, they were keeping these idols close to them, and not only keeping them, but worshiping them. So the question is, were they really following God? That's kind of a rhetorical question that I think he's putting back to these people, right, to these leaders. Were they really following God? And so it puts it back on them. Are you really following God whenever you've rejected someone that he sent in order to be our Redeemer?
Right. That's where he's going with this.
Yeah.
Now, in verse 37, he quotes Deuteronomy, when Moses was saying in Deuteronomy, God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren.
Yep.
This was a prophecy that Moses gave that said, there will be a prophet like me. Mm-hmm. And the passages around that, this is a prediction of the Messiah.
Right, because what did Moses do? He led them out of slavery. He led them out of Egypt. He communed with God directly. So in other words, he wasn't a regular or a normal prophet like any others. He was kind of at the pinnacle of these prophets. So the one who would come like him would be in that same genre.
The picture, and we talked about this when we went through Joshua, but when Israel was in Egypt, they were slaves. And the picture there is that the lost person is a slave to sin. And
right.
Just like Israel was brought out of Egypt, they were brought out of slavery in Egypt by Moses, then the lost person today is brought out of slavery to sin by Jesus Christ. And so that's the picture, is that Moses brought the people out of slavery. Moses is in Deuteronomy said, hey, there's going to be another one like me, and that's the Messiah. And so Stephen very astutely reminds them, remember, there's going to be another one, Moses said. And so he's going to, at the end of this talk, you were the person, right? You were the ones that missed the Messiah.
Right.
And so you missed Jesus.
Right.
He reminded the Jews that their forefathers had not recognized the true God and worshipped idols. Verse 42, turned away and delivered them up to serve the host of heaven. Mm-hmm. Stephen is again reminding the Jews that their fathers' past mistakes. Your fathers missed it.
Right.
Remember, they missed it here, they missed it there, all the way to the point where, think of that, God turned them over, removed his Holy Spirit from influencing them for the good, and left them to their own desires.
So they missed it. So don't think that you couldn't have missed it either, and that because they missed it, there was repercussions, and that just like them, if you missed it, there's going to be repercussions. So right. Again, these are the similarities that Stephen is bringing to these leaders.
We spoke about this briefly, but in verses 42 and 43, he's quoting the Old Testament prophet Amos, who said that Israel was not properly sacrificing while they were wandering in the wilderness. Think of it. This was the one, cloud by day, fire by night, follow God, went through the Red Sea, all those miracles. What were they doing? Towing the idols along with them. And Amos reminded them of that. Stephen here is reminding them that Amos had reminded them.
Right.
And so Stephen is again just accusing these Jewish leaders of the same sin that their forefathers did. And Stephen is using the Old Testament prophets to evangelize. We could do the same. We ignore prophets like Amos. And, that's the part of our Bible where the pages are nice and clean because no dirty fingerprints on them. But Stephen used Amos.
Right.
And we can use the minor prophets as well.
Right.
With that, Steve, our time's probably gotten away from us. And we're still not done. We're like maybe halfway done with Stephen's wonderful explanation here. But we'll pause it for now and leave it a bit hanging. Stephen is in the midst of giving his defense before these leaders. And we can just imagine these leaders, their blood pressure is getting higher and higher because he's reminding them of things that they didn't want to hear. But nevertheless, he's being very effective and he's doing God's will. And so we will learn what happens next time as we reason our way through the Bible.